Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar titled Safety and Public Amenity Considerations of a Regulated Cannabis Market. My name is Reese Cohen, and I'm the Global Partnerships and Engagement Advisor at Penington Institute. We are a not-for-profit organization focused on supporting cost-effective approaches to maximize community health and safety with regards to drugs, including pharmaceuticals and alcohol. And today I'm speaking from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many various lands from which we're all meeting from and speaking from today. This is the second webinar in a series titled Global Perspectives on Australia's Cannabis Future, where we ask leading experts to share their cannabis policy insights from Australia and around the globe, as we explore some of the big questions that need to be answered about how Australia could legalise and regulate the recreational use of cannabis. Today's webinar will run for about an hour, and it'll consist of a facilitated panel discussion followed by some time for audience Q&A. So I really encourage you to use the Q&A function to ask questions throughout today's discussion, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of the panel. This session will be recorded, and you'll be able to view it on the Penington Institute website. As I said, our topic for today is public safety and amenity. So we're going to be touching on issues including cannabis-impaired driving and cannabis impairment in the workplace, as well as the consumption of cannabis in public places and the role of advertising and promotion in regulated cannabis markets. So some really big topics. And I'm very excited to bring you our three expert panelists who will briefly introduce themselves, and then we can get stuck into it. So in no particular order, please welcome Dr. Gillian Shower. Gillian, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thanks to the audience for paying attention to this important topic. My name's Gillian Shower. I'm the Executive Director of the Cannabis Regulators Association. We're a nonpartisan association of government agencies from 43 states, the District of Columbia, 2 US territories, and Canada. We're not an advocacy group. We're focused on convening governments who are regulating cannabis to talk about the regulatory approaches they're taking, to learn from each other, to combine data when it makes sense to, and to identify best and emerging practice. My background, I have a PhD in behavioral science and a master in public health. I worked in tobacco control policy for a number of years before jumping over to the cannabis policy side. So happy to be here and hopefully to demystify some of the complexity of the topics we're going to talk about.
Wonderful. Thanks, Gillian. And also with us is Andrew Livingston. Andrew, could you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you so much. My name's Andrew Livingston. I'm the Director of Economics and Research at the law firm Vicente, LLP. I've been working in this field for over a decade, analyzing cannabis markets in the United States and internationally, and assisting businesses with understanding the different regulatory environments and what sort of business opportunities exist within those unique environments. I'm also a lifelong drug policy advocate and reformer. So I will take the side of pro-cannabis legalization and others. But yeah, happy to be part of this and discuss a little bit further about how Australia might consider moving forward and what sort of safety issues are really at the heart of legalization.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Andrew. And last but not least, Dr. Ryan Vandrey. Ryan, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm Ryan Vandrey. I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins University. I'm an experimental psychologist by training and behavioral pharmacologist. And for the last 25 years, I've been working on studying the impact of drug use on behavior. And 23 of those have been focused on cannabis. And so I've done everything from studying cannabis dependence and withdrawal to the acute effects of cannabis administered through a variety of routes of administration, doses, and formulations. And our mission in my lab right now is to provide scientific data to inform policy.
Fantastic. Well, let's jump straight into it. The first sort of topic that I'd like us to talk about is impairment. So Ryan, this is probably a good question to start you off on. Definitely one of the biggest safety concerns that we have in Australia with regards to cannabis policy in general, be it medicinal or otherwise, is impairment, especially on the roads. How concerned should people be about the risks of cannabis impairment when it comes to driving and working in high risk environments? Ryan, why don't you start us off?
So the answer is you should be concerned, but there's lots of nuance to this, as with anything with cannabis. So I think to start with, cannabis is not a very helpful term for me. So are we talking about THC or are we talking about CBD? So it's important to understand the chemical constitution of the product in question is very important. As we know, THC does induce impairment after acute use, but CBD does not. And there are other minor cannabinoids like CBN and CBG where we still need data. The route of administration is important. We're worried about impairment with oral dosing or inhaled dosing, but not with topical dosing. The other key thing here is understanding the amount of dose and how we're detecting impairment. Our biggest challenge right now is understanding how do we identify somebody who's impaired versus unimpaired, and how can we attribute that impairment to acute cannabis exposure versus some other source of impairment, be it another drug, be it sleep deprivation, or something else. And I think my last point on this is that we need to recognize that while we have a really nice system in place for detecting impairment for alcohol, alcohol is the unique outlier in that case, and that we don't really have very good objective methods of detecting impairment for most other drugs that can cause impairment, or other behavioral things, like I said, sleep deprivation, that could cause impairment in driving. So it's absolutely a concern. The solution to that problem is still unclear at this point, but it's something that needs to be addressed.
Could I?
And I would add that I was just going to add, I think there are some combinations that are particularly concerning. So the combination of THC and alcohol, we know and have data to suggest that that is worse than either substance alone when it comes to being on the roads. And we've seen, at least in the US, we've seen state policies try to draw lines to avoid the combination of those two. There's no state in which you can legally combine an alcoholic beverage with THC, for example. And part of that has to do with what we know about the danger of that combination on the road.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we have similar, some states in Australia have similar policies where the combination of alcohol and other drugs is a greater offence when it comes to road safety. Can I ask, obviously today's topic is cannabis, and it's appropriate for us to focus on cannabis, but Ryan, you mentioned a few other sort of concerns there, fatigue in general, or cognition sort of in general, and also other drugs that we know may cause impairment. There are drugs that are even more commonly used in Australia than cannabis. I'm thinking SSRIs, for example, or other antidepressants. Are there similar risks with those drugs, and we have a particular concern about cannabis because of its illicit nature, or how would you describe that?
Absolutely. I think that cannabis being a drug of abuse that's now being switched into a different regulatory category, right? It's been legalized. And so the expectation is there have been a lot of parallels drawn between alcohol and cannabis. And there's reason for wanting to draw those similarities, but we have to understand that if we're talking about cannabis as a therapeutic, there are a number of prescription medications that can impair driving, for which we have no roadside test to determine or detect whether somebody's using it. It's rather there's a prescription, and on the prescription it says don't drive or operate heavy machinery while you're using this drug. And most people abide by that, but eventually people will take a benzodiazepine or an opioid pain reliever and still operate a car. It's our job right now, as we're changing these policies, to understand what we can and can't do, what are the limitations. And so while we can detect if someone has used cannabis through saliva tests or blood tests or urine tests, those tests are incapable of differentiating someone who's acutely impaired at the moment versus someone who's not. And so trying to implement policies that suggest that they do is problematic, because you either will miss people who are impaired, but they're clean or negative on those tests, or you're going to prosecute people who are acting responsibly. And so it's very critical that we recognize and understand limitations and look for other methods of detecting impairment that maybe are less specific to cannabis. But again, there's even still a challenge there in taking and identifying impairment in someone with a single endpoint. So I think where people are trying to go on the academic side is really how can we triangulate multiple sources of information to determine if someone is acutely impaired while operating a vehicle or in the workplace in a safety sensitive environment.
Interesting. One of the places that we can look to see what works and what doesn't with these kinds of policies is the United States. And it's really great that we've got three North Americans with us today. When we look across the patchwork of experiments that is the US cannabis regulatory environment, how are various states and jurisdictions in the US handling this problem? Like in Australia, we have widespread and high level, also very frequent random roadside drug tests for the presence of THC. But I understand that's not a common practice. How are other jurisdictions sort of handling this, Andrew and Gillian?
Yeah, we have a couple different. Go ahead, Andrew.
No, I was Gillian as a regulator. Go for it first. I'll fill in any other additional thoughts afterwards.
Yeah, we have a couple different policies at play. There are a number of states that have a zero tolerance law for THC, which I think, Reese, is what you said Australia has. But now more and more there are states that have an under the influence of DUID law, which, as Ryan said, does require an officer to determine that someone is under the influence. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then we have a handful of states, I think it's 4 or 5 now, that have a per se limit in place. Usually it's 5 nanograms per milliliter. Those per se limits have admittedly, even by states and regulators, not been set based on a lot of science. They were set based on what was perceived as a need to sort of draw a line and have a similar approach to the 0.08 threshold for alcohol. But as Ryan said, there are a lot of limitations in actually implementing policy in that regard. So what we see states doing now is increasingly training DRE and A-RIDE officers who are basically drug recognition experts who have the training to try to identify at the point of a traffic stop whether or not somebody is intoxicated, impaired, and then ideally what the drug at play is. But there are huge complications to this and to the data that we have in this space too. Often to confirm that cannabis is, or THC is, implemented or implicated, they have to take somebody down to precinct, they have to draw blood. That can take 1 to 3 hours. By the time they draw the blood, the person may not actually be intoxicated by THC. So there are barriers to that. The DRE training itself is also a barrier. It's quite expensive and can be hard to come by for states. So there's a shortage of officers that have the training to do that. And the data is impacted by all the other substances as well. So in some states, there's still what we would call a stop testing rule, where if somebody is pulled over for a traffic stop and they blow a 0.08 for alcohol, so they are intoxicated by alcohol, they will not be tested for anything else. So that really has a way on what the data tell us about how much THC is implicated in roadside infractions, in fatal crashes, et cetera. The data, even by the admission of our federal agency that keeps those data, is difficult to use to answer some of those hard questions.
And Andrew, anything to add there, or could you speak to whether you think those policies are effective even, or have there been any challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Rice. I would say that it's important to, when we look at driving while under the influence laws, that many of these, while they are determined and created by state legislatures and regulators, it's really hammered out in the court systems, as these are things that get to the real nuance. So for instance, there's a difference between per se limitations and permissible inference limitations. So in a per se limitation, if you are above, let's say 5 nanograms per milliliter, which is some of the standards that states set, you are deemed intoxicated. There may be ways to defend that. There may not be, oftentimes the defense of that has more to do with the circumstances around the stop than it has to do with the fact that they blew or tested. more than a certain amount. Or it could be that, there was the testing machinery they were using was not certified or had not been, checked in its normal maintenance in a time period. And so the defense attorney will throw that out. There's also limitations that are permissible inference, which basically means that the jury is able to infer that they were intoxicated, but it's not automatically the case. That essentially allows the defense attorney to provide other evidence that, essentially says that although they, may have tested it 7 or 8 milligrams per milliliter in blood, they are not intoxicated for other reasons. Maybe they're a medical cannabis patient with much higher tolerance, things like that. I think one of the major issues is, as Jillian was mentioning, this is not a alcohol test where you can just exhale into a machine. There isn't one of those that has been certified yet. So you have to be taken to the precinct, or they have to call an ambulance for a licensed phlebotomist, that's someone who can draw blood, to be able to take that blood draw. That is costly, time consuming. And again, because of the way that cannabis spikes in your blood, essentially the amount in your blood after, shortly after consumption, you may drop down quickly there. There's also, of course, the dynamics between edibles and flower, and the way that essentially stays in your blood for different periods of time, but doesn't necessarily always correlate. And this is probably something Ryan can speak a lot more to, that your degree of intoxication is related to, but not necessarily directly related to, the amount of THC in your bloodstream.
Mm-hmm. Ryan, can I bring you in there and ask you to respond to Andrew's point, but then also give me your opinion, or give us your opinion on whether you think the Australian approach is effective or suitable? I mean, as someone who knows the Australian system relatively well, I'd be interested to get your thoughts.
Yeah, so and working with my Australian colleague Tom Markell and Ian McGregor and others on this, we've actually published on the failings of per se limits. We have now repeatedly done laboratory experiments where we have demonstrated that there is no threshold of THC or THC metabolite concentrations in urine, blood, or oral fluid that can accurately, reliably, and sensitively predict whether somebody's impaired due to cannabis. Andrew hit on a really important point, that route of administration is very important, and the frequency that someone uses a product is very important. The kinetics of cannabinoids are just not linear in the body, and that's why this is so challenging, whereas alcohol is very linear. I do want to point out another thing that I think is important to keep in mind here, though, in terms of what North America is doing. So we have a variety of policies in place, and it's different from one state to the next. But at the federal level, as well as at the local level, there's been intense investment in figuring this out. So, for example, here in the state of Maryland, the state police run training labs, and they're trying to work with drug recognition officers to figure out what kind of field sobriety tests are sensitive to the acute impairing effects of cannabis, where they bring people in, allow the people to use their own cannabis in front of them, and they have these people who are trained experts in detecting impairment, trying different ways of understanding and figuring out what differentiates someone who's impaired due to acute cannabis exposure versus not. And then the other thing is that the federal government has invested millions of dollars into research for people to develop technologies that can do this better, right? And so people have looked for breathalyzers, eye tracking equipment, apps that measure cognitive performance in areas known to be impacted by acute cannabis exposure. And so that's something that I would highly encourage Australian governmental agencies to engage in, and law enforcement agencies. Is it's up to you to figure out, help everybody figure out. And I think this needs to be a global effort, because this is happening globally, is there needs to be a push and an investment in resources and research to figure out what's the best way of going about this. How can we best keep people safe without prosecuting individuals who are not putting other folks at risk, right? And so that's our challenge right now. And whatever system we come up with may not be perfect, but we need to determine what's the best approach.
Mm, mm. I'd love to. I mean, we could talk about driving all day, but I think we should. Well, we probably have to move on at some point. But thank you for those contributions. Really interesting stuff. Sort of moving conceptually, moving from public safety to issues of public amenity. The other topic that I was hoping that we could cover today is public consumption of cannabis, especially in places that have legalized and regulated cannabis. It's an issue that tends to come up quite a bit in the conversations that I have with people in Australia about, fears or concerns around that. Is that an issue that's ever sort of featured prominently in various global jurisdictions, North American or otherwise?
I would say absolutely. Oh, go ahead,
Sorry,
Andrew. Sorry, we always want to jump in.
No worries, both of us. Yeah, I would say that by and large, social use or public consumption use in the United States, from a legal and regulated standpoint, has not blossomed yet. We've seen, some states move forward with, whether it's the state of Nevada, California, Colorado's trying to work on it, some other states are trying to work on it, Alaska, but by and large, it's not a significant centerpiece of cannabis regulation, in the way that, probably the most robust experiment with public consumption is in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And because of that, it's hard to really know how public consumption will influence public safety, as in a state like Colorado that legalized back in 2012 and opened adult use stores in 2014, we have less than 24 and probably less than a dozen or so operating cannabis social use venues. And so it's relatively new here. There are also some experiments with event permit license, whether or not that's like a county fair type booth area, or whether or not that's public consumption at a cannabis festival or music festival. But by and large, it's hard to really see how this is going to impact social, cultural, and community interactions, because it hasn't really come into force yet.
Interesting.
So, and I'm going to comment on some of the reason why I think that is, and why this is one of the hardest policy questions for regulators and for states right now. So putting my public health hat on, there have been decades of progress in secondhand smoke and clean indoor air policies that could be unraveled very quickly with exemptions that are made for cannabis. It's extremely difficult to tell, is somebody vaping cannabis, or are they vaping nicotine? Are they really smoking just cannabis or smoking something else? And we're starting to get a sense of where the health effects might be as well. There's some great work out of UCSF in San Francisco showing not just that the constituents of secondhand cannabis smoke are very similar to tobacco, but some of the acute health effects in animal models appear to be very similar as well. So you have this public health argument. You have public health advocates who don't want to see the decades of progress in secondhand tobacco smoke unraveled by exemptions for cannabis. But the reason this is so complicated is because there's also a huge equity argument to be made for cannabis. And a lot of the reason why states have voted to legalize is because of the failed war on drugs and wanting to try to right the wrongs of that. And if you don't create public spaces where it's legal for people to consume cannabis, states are realizing they've effectively only legalized cannabis for people who own their own home. And people who are in rented housing or federal housing continue to have, in some cases, criminal repercussions, and that's not okay. So there's this need to find a nexus where you're balancing potential public health risk, which especially for workers could be very different. I would venture to say that even workers that consume cannabis aren't consuming cannabis for 8-10 hours a day. The exposure that they would get by working in a consumption establishment could be very different. You have to balance that with also providing a space. So I think what we've seen states do in the US is state legislatures for the most part, it's not been regulators, it's been legislators, have passed policies that have created an okay for this, but have put a lot of parameters in place that don't make this an economic boom for business. So you can't sell alcohol in most of, in any of these. You can't sell food in most of these. In some of them, you can't even sell the cannabis. It has to be brought. In others, you can only use the cannabis from the store. So there are all these safeguards that I think have been put in place to try to avoid over commercialization of public consumption that have created an economic situation where it's not a really viable place for business to go. So the discussions happening now in the regulatory environment are, how can you do this? How can you truly create these spaces? But how can you do it without the unintended public health consequences? And I don't think we're not even close to having all the answers. So this is a super challenging question. I would welcome anyone on the line who has insight to share. I'll make sure my email gets out. Would love to hear from anybody with ideas here.
I would say that there may very well be some technological solutions from, depending on how cold your climate is, outdoor heaters, obviously, outdoor smoking, while it also has its secondhand smoke issues, is much less of a problem than indoor smoking. Yeah. It gets into the real nuanced grittiness of like, what type of HVAC equipment do you need for indoor air circulation? As that very clearly, if you can blow a smoke ring inside, it's probably not enough of an HVAC system to clear the smoke out and help people's lungs there. I would also say, yeah, go for it.
I was just going to say, ASHRAE, who sets the clean indoor air standards, has said that no HVAC can clear the smoke. So, I mean, I think the workaround we're seeing for that is policies that say, separate enclosed smoking area so that workers can view from outside, but I do think the Denver model is a great example where Denver, Colorado initially, stuck their toe in the water here and said outdoor smoking, no smoking indoor, obscured from view. I think they really were trying to mitigate the things you're talking about, Andrew.
Yeah. I mean, I would also ask the question of, it's like, so for obscured from view, for instance, right? So, what is the harm we're trying to protect from? Is we're trying to protect from people smelling cannabis? Obviously you can smell things if you can't see it. Are we trying to prevent young people from knowing that people consume cannabis? I think that's a folly, particularly in a state like Colorado, in which it's part of the culture, right? Like, if we're like, oh, cannabis is so bad, we want to protect the eyes of children as if it was, a nudist colony or something like that. I think that is heaping an amount of stigma that is unwarranted. And I think it was also, as someone who's a cannabis consumer and thinks about this more from kind of the business, economic, and social side of things, as a reformer, I think the cannabis social use as an element of cultural and social reform, right? If you do believe that cannabis and alcohol to some degree are substitutes, even if it's not for the individual, but culturally. And if we are creating avenues for people to socially consume alcohol, and of course there are harms associated with that, but we treat, cannabis as if the only place you could purchase, imagine if alcohol was legal, but you could only buy it in a liquor store, restaurants couldn't sell it, and there were no bars. You would basically say to yourself, well, like, that kind of alcohol culture stinks. Like, it's just not fun in any way. And that is essentially what we've created in cannabis, stunting the ability culturally for what I personally believe is a less harmful substance from kind of counterbalancing some of the significant alcohol culture that we have in the United States. And from my time studying abroad in Australia, a significant alcohol culture in Australia.
Oh yeah, you better believe it.
I just one more quick thing. Oh, go ahead,
sure.
Reese.
Oh, no, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think there's also been some state approaches where they try to borrow from tobacco control and pass policy that says, okay, anywhere you can smoke a tobacco product, you can smoke a cannabis product. That's not perfect either, though, because nicotine is not an intoxicant. It does do things to your brain, but it's not an intoxicant in the same way. So I don't think we have a perfect model to borrow from either alcohol or tobacco for different reasons. Alcohol is not combusted, so different policies apply there. So cannabis is its own reality, and we've not figured it out, I think, is my takeaway for everybody here.
Just one quick thing that I'd love to maybe, I don't know, and Ryan, if you have any thoughts on this, but the harmful effects of inhaling cannabis smoke as opposed to inhaling tobacco smoke. I mean, I'm ignorant largely of the literature on that. Are they comparable in terms of harms, to your knowledge, or?
Smoke is sort of what the research shows. Go ahead, Ryan.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, the research has definitely shown that smoking cannabis and smoking tobacco have a lot of the same tars and other harmful carcinogens in them. And we actually did, going back, I don't know, about 10 or 12 years ago, probably I think the most recent controlled experiment on secondhand cannabis exposure. And we sealed people up in a room and had half of them smoke cannabis joints for an hour and the other half just kind of sat there, and we varied the level of ventilation in the room, and we were able to show that, you know, in an enclosed environment with poor ventilation, passively exposed individuals did feel a little high, and they had detectable cannabinoids in their blood and in their urine and in their saliva. So the exposure is real. It's something to be factored in. And I think that's why it's challenging, as Jillian said, is, you know, do we borrow from alcohol policy or do we borrow from tobacco policy? And cannabis is unique in that it's smoked, it's vaped, and it's orally ingested. So it crosses both thresholds, and it almost is like you need more than one policy, and the policy needs to be product specific or route of administration specific. So it's, again, speaks to the nuance of cannabis and how it really is unique.
And I think what's interesting is the UCSF group that I talked about, it's Matt Springer's group, if anybody wants to look up the studies. His study was really interesting on some of the acute effects from secondhand smoke exposure, because he looked at, he took THC out of the joint, he took CBD out of the joint, he took the paper out. I mean, he did all these different things to see, is there a particular culprit? And his conclusion was really, anytime you're combusting anything, it's going to have some effects for humans. We don't understand all of the array of cannabinoids and how those might mitigate certain effects or, you know, compound certain effects. But at the end of the day, when you're burning something, it has some potential effects.
Unfortunately, we really had to move on to our next topic, although once again, we could discuss this for another whole hour. I'd also just love to remind the audience that we will have time for questions at the end. So if you have any questions or thoughts that come up, make sure you're using the Q&A function and asking those questions, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the session. The final massive topic that I was hoping we could touch on today, which also relates to sort of issues of public safety and amenity, is advertising in regulated cannabis markets. It's a big one. At a general level, like, what are the concerns that people have about advertisements and promotion when it comes to cannabis? And do you think they're warranted? Andrew, maybe do you want to start us off?
Yeah, so, you know, I think the primary concern from a public health situation for advertising is whether or not advertising is being targeted towards young people. So that's one portion. And whether or not advertising generally changes the cultural stigma and the accessibility, the visibility of cannabis, having a larger impact on young people than its intended audience of older individuals. So there's kind of both. And many states, really focus on the former, which is making sure that, the content of cannabis advertising is not attractive to children. So sometimes it's a subjective measure. You can't have cannabis that's attractive to children. What is attractive? That's typically up to regulators as far as their enforcement decisions. There's also sometimes, specific things. So for instance, you can have cannabis advertisements that show people consuming cannabis in some places, or you can't sell cannabis products in the shape of humans, animals, or fruit. Again, that's weird. You can have them in vegetables, in rocket ships, I guess, but not in humans, animals, or fruit. You have to ensure, in some states, the ratio depends, that more than 70% of your audience is over the age of 21, i.e., you can't advertise in a place in which there is even close to a majority of individuals under the age of 21. And there's many other different things. You can't, have posted leaflets on cars. You can't have certain promotional advertisement. Some places you can't have billboards, or the billboards have to show that those viewing it are more likely to be over the age of 21. So this really kind of depends. Of course, the United States is different than the rest of the world when it comes to the First Amendment and commercial speech, which does limit to some degree government's ability in the long-term post-federal legalizations in kind of curtailing advertising at large. But that's oftentimes how different states have started to treat the issue so far.
So can I ask, and Gillian, you can probably jump in here, that the First Amendment essentially protects commercial advertisements in a way that continues to allow cannabis to be advertised? Or could you talk me through that nuance?
I would defer to the lawyer on that. I can speak to
some. Not a lawyer, but yeah.
I think in state policy, we see a number of medical states that have banned advertising. They have a bit more ground to stand on there because it's not legal for the general population. It's legal only for patients. But when states legalize recreational use, which I prefer to call adult use, we have seen virtually no states be able to do that with a full ban for advertising because the First Amendment does protect commercial free speech. There have been some individual state challenges, but nothing to my knowledge that has really risen to sort of try that, because states are aware of that when they enact policy. So nobody's tried to ban advertising outright moving into a recreational state. I think the concern, I do agree with Andrew, the concern is really that the presence and exposure to advertising could create increased use among youth. And there have been some studies, a group out of University of Washington's done a couple of really good studies on cannabis advertising exposure and changes in use and perception by youth. So I think that's a legitimate concern, and we don't have all the data we need to know how far that would extend. But states are challenged in what they can do because of the First Amendment. So we've seen states ban certain mediums like billboards, for example. We've seen, states, as Andrew said, restrict content on ads. We've seen a number of states require warning labels on ads. But if you came to the United States, especially to a state that had an adult use market, there would be a lot of advertising around. And it looks very different than, say, tobacco, because tobacco is subject to the master settlement here in the United States, and so is restricted in the advertising that can occur there. And that's not really been tested in terms of cannabis at this juncture.
I would also say it's very important when you're looking at advertising to recognize that, you could ban TV advertising or fully allow TV advertising. I think that's going to have a pretty small impact on young people who by and large don't watch TV, right? So if you think about what, medium young people are using, the arbiters of the availability of cannabis advertising largely depends on Facebook, Google, Instagram, TikTok, and others, Twitter, X, I guess, and other social media platforms, the majority of which, do not allow for cannabis advertising. And so in some ways, sure, commercial free speech is one thing, but given that young people oftentimes consume advertising on private mediums that are able to either allow or disallow cannabis advertising, it's almost to a certain extent which the regulators have less of a control over it than we might think. Now, of course, they can limit a company's ability to or licensed company ability to advertise, but there are many, whether it's a clothing brand or non-licensed entities, which are essentially outside of the purview of cannabis, the state licensed cannabis regulators. And if the concern is, well, what we want to do is tamper down the social norms and visibility of cannabis use, cannabis licensees that actually sell the product may not be the ones that are doing that in the way that we are most concerned about.
Yeah, very interesting. Ryan, jump in there. Thanks.
Advertising is not my bag, but I want to add to this a couple things that haven't really been discussed. I mean, youth use is paramount and obviously one of the main concerns there, given historical issues we've had with tobacco and alcohol. But cannabis, again, there's nuance and it's unique because are we talking about therapeutic use or are we talking about non-therapeutic use? And so advertising can infer health benefit where there's no demonstrated health benefit, and that's a concern. And in alcohol and in tobacco advertising, there are warnings that are required, and there are the advertising restrictions that we have in place in a number of areas is rooted in science and regulatory science. And so again, my job is to advocate for research and science here and science-based policy. And so I think that we don't really know what's happening on the cannabis advertising side yet. And so again, to kind of advocate for investment and resources to understand that and to determine policies based on regulatory science. So in the US on the tobacco side, they invested money into research to understand the impact on different methods of advertising, different kinds of warning labels, different visuals that could communicate risks and also just to determine youth impact. And I think that's needed here. We can't expect blindly that what works for cannabis or for tobacco and alcohol will also apply to cannabis. And it is unique, and it is one that lives in the therapeutic and the non-therapeutic role. And so I think it's important to understand that, and that gets factored into policy decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, from the Australian perspective, we have some of the most effective advertising restrictions on tobacco, for example, complete plain packaging and absolute prohibition on any promotion or advertising, which I fully support. And we also have quite thorough laws and regulations around managing unapproved therapeutic claims for goods, which has been a big feature of the medical cannabis system over here. Actually, has been contention and issues around the extent to which those regulations are enforced. But of course, the gap is always, well, that's an overseas website. It may be advertising in a way that's not prohibited, in a way that's not permitted, and it's advertising directly to Australians. But it's an overseas site and it's outside of our jurisdiction. Yeah, Gillian.
Yeah, so we do have states that have plain packaging for cannabis packages. They tend to be medical states. Connecticut was the first state that in statute was supposed to have plain packaging for their adult use market, and they had a lot of backlash, and that is now only going to be rolled out, or only being rolled out for edibles, where there's concern that particular packaging might appeal to youth and have them accidentally consume. Connecticut also is the example of the state that's gone the furthest with regard to advertising restrictions. So Andrew talked about most states have just borrowed from alcohol, from the alcohol industry's self-policing or self-monitoring of advertising to say 71.6% of your audience has to be adult. When stated differently, almost 30% of your advertising audience could be underage. So Connecticut drew the line at 90%. And they are just rolling out their adult use market. So I do think we have a laboratory for study in the US happening, because we have a lot of different policies, and hopefully researchers will take advantage of that.
Is that kind of an approach viable? I'm talking about like a complete prohibition on advertising. Are there any? Yeah, sorry.
No, a prohibition would never stand up in court here unless there was some sort of a master settlement, which I think cannabis is very different than tobacco, and we are not headed that route. But I do think states are trying to figure out how can you make sure that advertising is truly to adults only. In terms of packaging and labeling, we also need a lot better science. Every state is requiring warning labels. They are requiring no false claims or false advertising around health effects. And they struggle to enforce that because a lot of it, as Andrew said, is very subjective. What does it mean to not appeal to kids? What does it mean to say no bright colors or no cartoons? So I think Canada is a country to look at. They have more uniform packaging. as opposed to saying what should not be on the box. They have said, this is what is on the box, and this is where the things go. I'm not sure the industry loves that, but from an enforcement standpoint, it does present an easier opportunity to make sure that people are either compliant or not. So we need more data. We need somebody to study the landscape in the US, and we need to figure out what translates from tobacco control and alcohol and what doesn't.
Yeah. And I would say one of the larger questions that we have to ask ourselves here, as far as the purpose of advertising restrictions, is, are we trying to stop the normalization of cannabis use? Are we trying to take this product and push it into a portion of our society, which it's like, sure, it's legal, but it is stigmatized, or it should, not be used generally, right? Well, one of the health benefits of not just the plain packaging, but in many countries, I'm pretty sure this is the case in Australia, they have like super gross images of
Right.
your mouth cancer and things like that. It's almost in the same way as, I'm not sure if this is the case for Australian sex education, but in the United States, sex education in schools is almost entirely images of people with significant STDs, and it's a scare tactic, right? It's meant to educate people of the risk, but it's only focusing on the dire risks in a way to stigmatize the dynamic, right? So the question is do we want to stigmatize cannabis use and cannabis culture in such a way that this is legal, but it's a little bit verboten, but alcohol and other substances, that's the one that's okay, right? Over the last decade, 2 decades, I think one of the things that has dramatically reduced tobacco use is not just the education on it, not just the indoor smoking restrictions, but how the combination of those indoor smoking restrictions and education reduced the number of people that use to such an extent that the culture around tobacco shifted from being, everyone on TV is smoking tobacco to people just smoke tobacco in a small little area outside of their work, right? So when we look at the relative harms of, say, the 3 substances, cannabis, alcohol, and tobacco, in which way do we want to balance that cultural acceptance and stigma across the 3 of them? I imagine there would be public health benefits if all 3 of them were stigmatized and no one used any of them, but that's unlikely given that humans generally strive for some degree of, intoxication.
Right. It's really interesting getting these perspectives from you all, because you are living in a very different cultural context. And I would say, regardless of what the ideal state is for any of these regulatory settings in Australia, I think we are reaching the first step of the ladder when it comes to cannabis law reform, and probably would be sensible to prioritize policies that avoid normalizing or incorporating cannabis into the broader society or culture, just from a political feasibility sort of standpoint, if for no other reason. But we are getting towards the end of our time here. Sorry, Gillian, to cut you off. I just want to encourage anyone who hasn't yet asked a question to pop it in the Q&A box now. But was there one final thought you wanted to leave us with, Gillian, before we move on?
I was just going to say, I do think in the US, the focus from a regulatory standpoint has been on youth prevention. It's not been on stigmatizing. I think states are very mindful and conscious of that. We don't have enough time to get into it, but in the US, we've regulated the cannabis sativa plant, in 2 very different ways. It's federally legal as hemp, and it's federally illegal as cannabis. And there's a little line they've drawn in the sand with Delta 9. Long story short, we have products being marketed as hemp that aren't adhering to any advertising restrictions and are very appealing to kids and look exactly like commercial packaged foods. I want to be clear to leave the audience with the understanding that the regulated state cannabis markets, I think most of the operators in those markets are quite responsible and are really trying to avoid appealing to youth. There may be a couple bad actors here and there, but it's not the state regulated markets where we have the egregious violations of advertising. It's really in the cannabinoid hemp space right now, which is unregulated, and that may be unclear to folks in other countries, but That's a topic for a separate webinar.
That is I mean, we've already covered 4 or 5 massive topics in an incredibly short period of time. So thank you so much to all 3 of you. And we do have time for a few questions from the audience. There's one that's come through, Ryan, which is directed at your good self, that says, Ryan, you say that, per se laws aren't probably effective for drug impaired driving. Fair enough. What about permissible inference laws? Do you think these are reasonable use of a lab detection of drugs in a law enforcement context? I hope that formulation makes sense to you.
So again, I'm not certain on the legalese there. Based on Andrew's statement before, maybe I can try to figure that out. But I think what's important here is that it really depends on what's the matrix and what's the cutoff that you're using, what's the threshold. And just to give an example, in our controlled laboratory studies where we have people who come in various states, but they're under supervision, we know exactly what they've been exposed to, and we collect blood, spit, and urine from them repeatedly over the course of between 1 and several days. I have seen, just to throw one example out, if we say 2 nanograms per milliliter of THC in blood, I've seen someone at that level who's a heavy daily user and they haven't used in 24 hours. They are unimpaired, fully unimpaired. I've seen people reach that after secondhand exposure to cannabis for 1 hour. They might feel a little bit of a drug effect, but generally unimpaired. That could be the same for a person who just smoked a joint an hour ago and they are impaired, but coming down. And I've seen the same threshold of someone who ate 50 milligrams of THC in a brownie and they can barely stand up. So you have the same level. It's a commonly used threshold for different people, for different circumstances, and very different levels of impairment. Now, you can add some behavioral assessment of intoxication to that. And again, I mentioned triangulating multiple data points. You can maybe surmise that, but again, individuals are going to be different in baseline unimpaired states on their performance of behavioral tests of impairment. We've still not figured out what kind of test, whether it's a balance test, whether it's a cognitive test, whether it's an eye tracking test, that reliably differentiates someone who's intoxicated or impaired due to cannabis versus not. Whereas with alcohol, you get saccadic eye movements, you get very impaired balance. We don't know what that is yet with cannabis. And so if you have someone above, off the charts at 50 nanograms per milliliter of THC, you smell cannabis in the car, you can probably effectively prosecute that person. But there are going to be many cases of people impaired that you don't smell it because they ate it. And they're not going to be at 50 nanograms per milliliter. They're going to be at 1 or 2. And we've had multiple instances where people got 10 or even 20 milligrams of THC, very impaired, and no detectable THC in their blood. So, and again, the timing becomes important because the window of detection is fairly short in an infrequent user, and it's very long in a frequent user. And so trying to interpret all of that becomes very, very challenging.
And it sounds like, based on that assessment, the current approach in Australia, which is random roadside testing of saliva, probably misses just as many people as it catches. Yeah.
You're going to arrest a lot of people who are responsible drivers.
And miss a lot of people who are severely impaired.
And miss people who, yeah, exactly.
Super interesting. One question that's come through that I'm not sure if Gillian or Andrew, you might have some thoughts on this, is when is it appropriate to test someone for the presence of cannabis or to be concerned about cannabis impairment in the workplace? And like, how is that sort of playing out throughout various US jurisdictions at the moment? Do you have any thoughts off the top of your head?
Okay, so there's been, I would say, probably the biggest change in workplace drug testing has been the decline in pre-employment drug testing for cannabis. Typically, that was urine analysis for metabolites, and was designed to just screen out people who consume cannabis, right? It was not, are you intoxicated in any way? It was just screening those people out. And, you know, given that most other substances are out of your body on the metabolite situation in a couple of days or a couple of weeks, cannabis was kind of rare for those who are heavier users. This could be in your, detectable levels of metabolite in urine for a number of weeks. So as additional states have legalized, that has largely fallen out. Now, in most states, or I think it depends, Jillian, you may know more on this, on which states, workplaces are able to continue their drug testing in the ways that they deem. So, there's probably less of them that are doing pre-employment drug testing. I know there are probably some states where it's not permissible anymore. It really depends upon whether or not the state deems that cannabis is a lawful off-duty activity. And in the cases where it might, essentially is deemed a lawful activity, your workplace can't, in the United States, ban you for engaging in consensual sex with someone of the same gender, right? That's a lawful off-duty activity, essentially. And so the question that we ask ourselves is, what type of jobs are sensitive enough that there can be physical issues? So let's say truck drivers or those operating a forklift or other things like that, they may have random drug screening. And in particular, if there is a workplace incident, oftentimes follow up with drug testing.
And I would just add, this is an area where state regulatory agencies usually don't get involved. States, often can get involved in the drug testing for state employees, just like at the federal level, where it is still illegal to consume cannabis, and you can lose out on a federal job if you admit to consuming cannabis or have a positive test. But in states, the regulatory agency can't get engaged in independent corporations and their decision. Where the regulators do often get engaged, though, and this is true for traffic stops as well, is if there's a patient who is using for medical purposes, the regulatory agency may be engaged in sharing data to support that indeed this is a patient, or verifying a patient card, and also increasingly educating law enforcement officials about patient rights. There have been a number of instances where a new state with a medical program, law enforcement starts stopping folks and, charging them with things when they are legitimate patients. And it requires some education between the regulatory agency and the law enforcement bodies so that they understand what patient rights are.
Wonderful, thank you. One probably our last question, which I'll throw to you, Ryan, is do you know of any good research on the effects of secondhand cannabis vaping as opposed to cannabis smoking?
I don't, and it's an area that we've considered getting to. We're trying to find the time to do that study. We just haven't yet. But again, we kind of look to what's been done on the tobacco and nicotine side of things. There's certainly exposure. We know that. It's not as harmful as combusted smoke, right? So the concern on secondhand vaping is exposure to the drug substance and not necessarily all the harmful byproducts of combustion. But there's also concern a little bit depending on the vaping device being used. So there was a research study that came out not too long ago about, metals from the coil, getting into the aerosol generated by the device, and potential for pulmonary harm there. So on the secondhand side, it depends on proximity, it depends on density and all of that kind of stuff. There are a lot of moving parts there. But by and large, vaping is less harmful than smoking on the first-hand, second-hand, and third-hand side. But it's not something that we should assume is benign.
Jillian, did you want to jump in there quickly?
Yeah, I have a different read than Ryan, because vaping cannabis or THC is different than vaping nicotine. So we know from our vaping lung injury outbreak in the US, THC was not the harmful agent. It was all the additives, excipients, diluents. The vaping hardware may have been at play, flavoring from terpenes in different ratios. There are lots of things that we don't understand about vaping policy for cannabis. So I'm not sure we're at a place where I would say that we can say vaping is safer than smoking, because there are a lot of additives that aren't regulated yet on the THC vaping side, and really good discussions in the industry and regulatory circles about how to do better there.
Wonderful. Although I guess it would be a different case for, say, dry herb vaporization, I would assume.
Yes, I'm talking about,
depends on the device and the product and all of that. So contaminants become a big issue with vaporizing devices.
Andrew, Gillian, and Ryan, thank you so much for your time today. I think we've just reached the hour, so I'll leave it here. But once again, thank you so much for joining us, and for everyone watching this webinar. It's been very informative. And go ahead and enjoy the rest of your afternoons and evenings or mornings, depending on where you are in the world.
Great, thanks, Reese. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.